welcome back for part 2 of talking about lighting design. If you haven't checked out part 1, you should probably stop here and watch that. Alright, let's get started. So the math of lighting design. We're not really here to talk about numbers, but big concepts. So theoretically, at this point in the process, the designer has fully internalized the moment-to-moment emotional ride of the script, plus all the required given circumstances, right? The where and when we are. And they can see in their head exactly what it is they need to make. The big question now is, how do you actually make it? The math answer is optical physics and photochemistry. The theater answer is the controllable properties of light. So, lighting design is a lot of fancy gear and lighting instrumentation, control boards, all that stuff. Maybe I'll do an episode on that later on. But regardless of what gear you have available, you still only have the same tools for expression, and we call those the controllable properties of light. In this case, we'll say they're distribution, intensity, movement, and color. There's a lot of ways you can divide these up, but we're just going to break it into these four for a kind of quick and dirty summary. I'll just leave those on the screen over there. For visual aids throughout this, I'll be referring to a quick set design I tossed together in some 3D software for a fictional production of Medea, and several photos from Theodore Lawrence shows. So the first one we want to talk about is distribution. This is a catch-all category for where is and where isn't the light on stage. And there's a lot of ways we can talk about distribution. I'm just going to break it into 3 elements. The first one being direction. Literally, what direction is the light coming from? This can have a huge impact on what the actors or the architecture looks like. For a simple example, you know that cliche of holding a flashlight pointed up at your face when you tell a scary campfire story? It warps all the features of your face, makes you look super weird. That's direction at work. Here's our fictional Medea set lit from the front. It makes it look kind of flat and, well, normal. Now, if we switch to a strong side light, that's pretty dramatic. We can adjust the shape and visual interest just by changing the direction of the light. Here's a picture from our production of Mamma Mia, lighting by Danny Rogovin. This is from the nightmare scene. You can see how much the faces are shadowed by lighting only from above the actors. You can tell who the actress is, but it's a bit spooky and mysterious, and it works well in that scene. The second element is shape and size. This is all included under distribution. How much of the stage is actually lit? How much isn't lit? Is it a small pool of light? Can we make the world seem very small just by placing an actor in a small pool of light and darkness all around them? Or we can separate them from the others with different lighting? This production photo from Camelot, here we have Arthur, and he's in his own pool of light. It's a very separate type of light than what's hitting the rest of the stage. Direction's still at work, as we can see his face is fully lit, and we know we should be looking there. It's a focal point. The downward light on the soldiers from above their heads, it hides their faces, but it shows their armor. The light behind the crowd in the back, it shows us their forms, but no real information. It turns them into an anonymous mob. Light on Arthur, darkness all around him, it kind of shows him as powerful, but separated from his kingdom. The third element, we'll say, is texture. And it's kind of an odd part of distribution, because texture can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes we're referring to patterns of light. If you look at this photo from Yours On, we placed what's called a gobo, which is a steel frame with holes in it, basically, inside of a light to have it throw this texture onto the stage. And this is fun because it alludes to architecture that isn't present, that might be casting shadows. It also adds more energy to a scene as the actors' bodies move in and out of the light. But texture can also mean something else. One way that 2 lights can feel different on stage is the texture of the light itself. You kind of have to use your imagination for this one, but if the beam of light hitting the surface was fabric, what would it feel like to the touch? Here's an example. Here's a very sharp edge light and a very soft edge light. Imagine you could touch each of them. How different would they feel in your hands? Would one be fluffier or softer? There's a lot I could say about distribution, but I'm kind of working in a limited time here, so I'll just summarize it again as where is the light, where isn't the light, and where is it coming from? The second controllable property that we have at our disposal should be pretty obvious. It's intensity. literally how bright is the light. But it's not that easy. Our eyes make it more complex than that. Scientifically, we have all sorts of ways of measuring illumination, lux, lumens, wattage, candela. But our eyes work hard to equalize the brightness of whatever environment we're in. We adapt easily, and it only takes sort of a few moments, like walking into a dim room or stepping outside. Because of this auto-adjustment our eyes are capable of, for the stage it's much more about the intensity of a light as compared to the rest of the environment, for whether or not we perceive it as bright. What this means is the brightness of each light only exists in relationship to the other lights. A really simple example of this is if you light a candle in a pitch dark room, it's kind of unbearably bright to look at for the first few moments. But if you light that candle outside on a clear day at noon, it's barely even visible. The candle's the same brightness, it's the environment that's changed. Our eyes only care about comparing a light to other lights in order to gauge how they should adjust. And in the same way, our eyes are drawn to look at the brightest spot. Let's take a look at this shot from Beauty and the Beast. The intensity of the light hitting Belle and the Beast tells us to look there. It's where the action is. And we're naturally going to want to look there because that's where the most information is. However, we still need enough light on the rest of the cast because in this moment it's important that we know they're sneakily listening in. With a camera in TV or movies, the camera tells us where to look by forcing things we shouldn't be focusing on outside of the frame. We only see what we're allowed to see, but in theater we can look anywhere on the stage we want. So the lighting designer has to constantly compose where our eyes should be going. And intensity is kind of the standard tool for this. Brighter things are more important, and things that we leave in the dark kind of disappear and are forgotten. The third way we can control our light expression on stage is through movement. The most obvious function of movement is those lights that can be programmed to actually move around, like those big beam units you probably see at concerts, wagging around, making a big spectacle. Another good example of that kind of movement is spotlights, the lights we point at the actor and follow them with. The spotlight's actually a great example of all the things we've talked about so far. Distribution, the actor in the spotlight is lit and everything else is not as lit. We should be focusing on that actor in particular in this case. The actor's lit from the front, giving us all the information about what we should be looking at. That's in intensity. The actor in the spotlight's brighter than everything not in the spotlight, telegraphing even more so that they're the important thing in this moment. And then movement, it actually follows them around. They bring the focal point of the stage with them as they walk around and dance. Tool-wise, the spotlight is the lighting way of saying, hey, look at this. But there's a little bit more to movement. If you've been to a show, you've probably noticed that the lights change sometimes, usually quite often, moment to moment. We call those changes cues. When the designer plans which lights are turned on and how bright and where they are, all our previous controllable properties, we call that a look. Each look begins as a blank canvas, just a dark room, and each look is important on its own, but just as important is how we transition from one look into the next as lights turn on and off, and we have just as much chance for expression in those in-between moments. This is also movement. Yeah, each light isn't wagging around like in a concert, but the location of the illumination is moving about on the stage. If you've ever seen something out of the corner of your eye and you quickly snap your head over to see what it is, that's because our brain and our vision react to movement. It's a survival thing. The same way we're always drawn to look at something brighter over something darker, movement is a way to tell the audience, hey, something's changed. Maybe it's in the mood, in the plot, one of the characters, the time of day, the location. Movement's an important portion of lighting communication. The last property that we can control in our design is the color of the lights. This could easily be its own video by itself. Color theory is complicated and deep, so I'm just going to kind of hit some interesting parts. Before we go forward, though, a couple of basic principles. Number one, light needs three things for us to see it. A light emitter, something that makes the light, a bulb, anything like that. A surface to reflect off of, and an eye to receive the reflection. Number two, Light exists as the visible spectrum, the rainbow. If you've seen a prism split the white light into the colors that make it up, each color's in there like an instrument in an orchestra. You hear the full sound of the orchestra, not just the violin, but it's in there. The entire spectrum isn't required to be there either. The red light that you see on a traffic signal when it tells you to stop, yeah, only the red part of the spectrum's there. That's how we're seeing red. So now that that's out of the way, the first thing we need to talk about with color from a lighting design standpoint is that nothing actually has color. Instead, surfaces have a tendency to reflect specific parts of the spectrum back to our eyes. Yeah, you think you got a blue book? No, you don't. You got a book that tends to reflect back to our eyes the blue part of the spectrum. It's a little pedantic, but why is that important? Because what happens if that part of the spectrum isn't hitting that book? Then that book can't be blue. It's going to look gray. The lighting designer can't control what parts of the spectrum an object wants to reflect, literally what color the scenic or costume designer made the object, but we can control how much and what parts of the spectrum actually hit the object, and then bounce back to our eyes. So on stage, we can put any color we want, any place we want, for any effect that we want. How do we begin to decide? Well, that takes us back to part 1. Color is so strongly tied to emotion. People have an immediate and severe reaction to color that's connected to both personal preference and cultural immersion. Different cultures and different historical periods had very different associations with color. Let's look at an example of color in use. This shot from Glass Menagerie shows us Tom in the present moment speaking directly to us, but remembering his sister and his mother, who are lit less bright, texturally hazy, but there's also a soft, gentle pastel light on them, contrasting against the harsh, cold, white light on Tom. At every moment on stage, every controllable property is at work, and if done right, every controllable property is planned for maximum impact. We want to always enhance what all the other areas of production are doing. Lighting is the icing on the cake, not the dessert itself. We support and amplify the set, the costumes, and the performers. And that's about all I can say about that. So, thanks everybody. I'll see you next time.